Gerald Schwab, thank you very much for permitting me to sit down and talk to a superstar. Here we are in the Holocaust Museum, and we had a chance to chat over the phone a couple days ago and learned that you were involved in a piece of the Nuremberg trial which not many people are aware of. And I guess to help for the tape, maybe recap a little bit of where you were born and sort of your timeline as to how you ended up at Nuremberg.
Well, very briefly, I was born like everybody else in 1925 in southwest Germany, a town called Freiburg on the edge of the Black Forest. Lived there until 1933. My father had an international business which was based primarily in Switzerland. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, we moved. This is a very involved story, but I'll give you the rough outline. We moved to Basel, Switzerland. From there, moved over to the border to St. Louis, France. We used to get, some of our mail used to be sent to St. Louis, but not the right one. In 1935, we actually moved back to Germany. I went to a German school till 1938, November 1938. Crystal Night of the pogrom of 1938, at which point I was asked to leave, something which did not disturb me terribly much because I was about to flunk Latin. I then, in 1939, when I think my mother got pretty sick and tired of me at home after November 10th, she applied for me to be included in the children's transport to England, and the answer came back saying, well, why don't you apply next door to you and to the children's transport to Switzerland. And Switzerland actually took about less than 300 children at that point. The Brits, by the way, took 10,000 within weeks in 1939. And I went back. I ended up in a Swiss farm, and I mean Swiss farm, tiny little town, very basic farm. To be quite honest, I don't think I was too well of a fit. I came out of a middle-class family, ended up with a Swiss farm family, which meant well. Mm-hmm. But I just wasn't cut out. In retrospect, I sort of feel sorry for them, or have felt sorry for them. Yeah. I stayed there, and then also was transferred to a Swiss fundamentalist group on the other side of Lake Zurich, a family that was absolutely wonderful. In May 1940, I went back to Germany. My parents were still there. My dad had not been given, my parents hadn't been given authorization to leave Germany because the Germans were obviously very much interested in foreign exchange, and a business in Switzerland and in France had the potential of generating foreign exchange, which it did. Mm-hmm. And so we finally, when they thought they had everything that my parents could provide, they gave the authorization, and we went to Stuttgart, where the American consulate was, got our visas to the U.S., Interestingly enough, we got the visas on the day that the Germans marched into the lowlands, May 10th, 1940. Within a week, we were in Genoa, Italy, and then off on the, I think it was the SS Washington, one of the cruise, or the transatlantic cruise, not cruise ships, came to the States. It's a long story. Anyhow, my parents went to work for a family in Long Branch, New Jersey, and I must say, I admire them. My dad, who was a businessman, my mother, we had maids and all this sort of business. She became a maid, he became a gardener chauffeur. Eventually, they took over a poultry farm in New Jersey, and they lived there very happily until my father's death in 1960. I had 2 years of high school by the time this was in Hightstown or Cranberry, New Jersey. I ended up in the Army with 2 years of high school, and not surprisingly ended up in the infantry. This was in '44, and became a replacement to the 10th Mountain Division in northern Italy. Saw the end of the war there, then transferred, became an interpreter, or translator interpreter in 5th Army headquarters in General Mark Clark's organization. And then moved on to an intelligence interrogation unit in Austria. Got my Army discharge in Vienna, 1946, and went to work when decided this was as good a time as any to get a job, and I signed up, still with 2 years of high school. I mean, this took gall for somebody to do this. I had a chance to go to Dachau. They had trials there, and but I decided to shoot for the big time, and I went to Nuremberg, and they tried me out in the main courtroom, and it was a complete fiasco. I was never suitable for a interpreter, and courtroom interpreter, which was simultaneous. In other words, you listened to the stuff and you had to translate it, which, especially in the case of German, is especially difficult because the verb always comes at the end.
Sure.
So you sort of had to guess what the guy is going to say or woman. Anyhow, so I became a translator, and later on became the interpreter in a unit which looked at the trial of the 7 organizations which also were part of the indictment of the International Military Tribunal. You had 23 main defendants plus 7 organizations. Outfits like Gestapo, SD, SA, General Staff, Reich's Cabinet. Let's see, all together there were 7. They were also on trial, and there were so many potential witnesses that the defense wanted to call, and also to a certain extent the prosecution, that they decided to establish a commission with 4 commissioners, 1 presiding each day, 4 commissions of a Brit, British Lieutenant Colonel Ari Neve was the head of it. A man by the name of Parker was the American. And you had, I believe it was Razumov, who was a Russian and a Frenchman. And they would hear witnesses. Now, we did not have the main witness, the main people from downstairs, from the courtroom. However, we ended up with the number two types usually. The hearings there were much more informal, to the extent that virtually no photographs or any of them exist. It was a room. It had could have visitors, or did have visitors, and the languages were purely German and English. In other words, you had one interpreter who sat next to the witness, and who did both the English-German and German-English. So that's how I ended up there. And then subsequently, after the first trial was over, I moved on to Berlin, where I was a junior research analyst preparing in for the subsequent trials that took place. I remember the trial we worked on specifically was the Ministry of Justice. Mm-hmm. And so our main focus was on Minister of Justice Tirak. Regrettably, we didn't find out for 2 months that the man had committed suicide, so that work was pretty well wasted. Mm-hmm. And I stayed there till about May 1947. Yeah, it must be 47, at which time I decided it was high time to get back to the States.
You had enough points then?
Oh, yeah. I was a civilian by then. Oh, yeah. And decided that while this was an interesting job, maybe I should finish high school first. So I went back to New Jersey, where the Rutgers University told me that I had better finish high school first. Well, no way. I did apply to some other schools, and I actually went to a school which did not require a high school diploma, which was the University of Chicago.
Really?
They did not require. So, very briefly, that was it.
Let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to pause for just one
I probably gave you too much here, but...
No, this gives me a great overlay, because now we're going to file back in. Just, what did you know about the commission itself? When they, well, let me back up. Did they have to test you in order to become an interpreter at the commission hearing?
Well, I became an interpreter after I flunked the simultaneous interpreting. They figured I could do consecutive, which I did. Yeah. But as I said, I think I mentioned earlier, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed is king. They needed people who spoke both reasonable German and reasonable English. And of course, when I left Germany, I was 15. So my German was quite limited. And I would say, I had no idea what some of the terms I finally came across later on, especially when I questioned the general staff and so on.
When the commission was set up, did they sit you down and tell you in what the perspective was at the time, that this is the piece of the IMT that we're sort of putting on the side here, we're going to have separate proceedings to understand about these 7 defendants? Did they explain that to you, or was it just a job at the time?
That was the job at the time. Yeah. Keep in mind, we all knew about the 7 organizations on trial, even though history has pretty well forgotten that part of it. No, it was, I was an avid reader even at that point, or certainly by the time I came to the States in '40, of history and political science. I used to drive the library in Hightstown, New Jersey, crazy with some of the books I tried to get, and they were very good at it. Anyhow, so that did not come as a surprise, or it wasn't. I wasn't just thrown into it.
Right. Did you, when you walk in that first day and you have a chance to see names that are very recognizable today, such as the head of the commission, Colonel Ari Neve, did that mean something to you at the time?
No, Neve meant something to me. He was a well-known British officer who had escaped, I think, once or twice from German prison camps and so on. No, we were just introduced.
Now, how did it actually function on a daily basis? You said there were 4 commissioners, one representing each country.
Only one at a time.
One at a time.
One at a time. Usually we had sessions in the morning and the afternoon. Usually there were 2 interpreters, one waiting either in the room or off in the main courtroom as a spectator, and the other one working. We normally wouldn't work longer than about an hour and a half apiece. It becomes a fairly tiring job.
So in many senses, it was an American process. The room would consist of the one commissioner,
Right.
the witness,
Right.
not a defendant, but a witness,
Some of them became defendants later.
in the subsequent trials.
Either that or were sent off to other countries who demanded their extradition.
Tradition.
And there were usually 3 or 4 assistant prosecutors who sometimes worked downstairs, sometimes upstairs. And they were usually, and of course, the defense lawyers, some of whom had defended groups or individuals in the main courtroom, but also defended organizations.
So each of the witnesses and potential defendants had their own counsel there as well.
It was usually, no, it was not individual. Well, they had a counsel, yeah, but it was usually a counsel for the organization, not an individual one.
So nobody was really, even though information that they may have said at that commission may have been used against them individually.
Well, these people, eventually towards the end of these proceedings, there was a discussion which of the witnesses was to be heard in the main court. And they were, I believe, about 22 of the witnesses that we had were later on heard in the main court. Plus, they had tens of thousands of affidavits, which were sort of summarized and provided to the court. The last month of the trial actually was taken up largely by the organizations of the main court, were taken up by the organizations.
Of some of the witnesses themselves, I mean, look at von Rundstedt and Kesselring, Halder, Milch.
Milch was not in
Milch
that.
was not one of them? Were these names that, again, as only 2 years of high school, but did these names, they walk in and you say von Rundstedt, oh my gosh.
Oh yeah. They were, I mean, you knew the top generals.
Right.
I mean, if you read Stars and Stripes, you had a pretty good idea who they were.
Did you have a reaction? You're sitting next to Rundstedt.
You did your best to be fair and non-committal. My biggest problem was that they usually wanted to know, usually when we had a break in between, we'd sit there, the defendant or the witness on one and myself, and of course the first question is, where did you learn your German?
Right.
Well, I didn't want to make these guys uncomfortable. They had enough problems. And so you hedged your answers. You sort of hemmed and hawed. When they got too persuasive or wanted too much to know, then you would sometimes tell them. I mean, I remember the fellow who was the acting head of the SA, a man like the name of Whitner at that point. The SA was under the leadership of his chief of staff, and that was Lutzer, who died in '43, and then somebody else took over from him, and he absconded, disappeared, and so Whitner was the man. And he was testifying about all the good work that the SA did, and how during Crystal Night they tried to do their best to protect the synagogues, but the population was so incensed. And he pushed and pushed, and I finally had enough. That's the one time, and I regretted it afterwards. I said, last time he wanted to know, where did you learn your good German? Well, in Germany, and I was there in 1938. I lived through Crystal Night. And as my British educated wife would say, the penny finally dropped. And he finally understood.
Interesting. You also had a conversation with Kesselring, I think, during a break.
Yes. We were both waiting in the anteroom. There were three of us, Kesselring, his guard, and myself. And we chatted. I mean, we had a discussion of the tactics. I mean, after all, he was a field marshal commanding German troops in Italy, and I was a PFC on the other side. So, you know, we had something in common. Again, as I say, it took a lot of gall.
Yeah.
And we had a friendly conversation, and he then wanted to know where I'd learned my German. I did tell him. And he was looking out over the prison block there. And so he turned to me and said, "That must be great satisfaction for you to be here." And the only thing I could say, "You're right, Field Marshal."
Did you find, I talked to a couple of interpreters who were involved more in the depositions of the main defendants, like Richard Sonnenfeld. I don't know if that name means anything. And Dick often said that the prosecutor would look to him and say, "What I would like to know is this," in essence, excuse me, here it is.
Go ahead.
No, I don't know. This is irrelevant. I forgot to turn it off. I'd like to know, X, Y, and Z. Then you would have to sort of ask the questions, not verbatim, but sort of couch the questions that tried to get the general answers. Did you find that same thing with yourself?
No, we did our best to reflect both what they said and the tone or the approach that whoever asked the question. I mean, it could be one of the defense lawyers, or more frequently, one of the assistant prosecutors. And you try to reflect the question, and as I say, the tone of voice, and they would answer. Hopefully they would keep their answer to a reasonable length. We had one interesting experience with Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who gave an answer that was at least 10 minutes long. Now, my memory was pretty good and I took notes, but 10 minutes over, that was just too much.
My word, yes.
And I just shrugged my shoulder and I told Arian Eve, "I'm sorry." So he says, "Well, let's ask the court reporter." We also had it. That was a court reporter. And the courtroom reporter said, well, I was hoping that when the interpreter, that he could enlighten me. So von Rundstedt was asked, please repeat your answer and cut it about at least halfway through. Yeah. And that's exactly what he did. It was one of the most amazing performances because word for word, he gave the same answer. Only halfway through he stopped, and then I translated, and then the other one came.
Did you have a light, or how would you tell them?
No lights. It was very informal.
Did you stop? Did you hold it?
Well, sometimes I would do it, but that, they were more interested in saying what they had to say than anything that the interpreter might do.
I noticed some of the names of the prosecutors who were part of the commission. Did any of those sort of jump out at guys who were very actively involved?
Well, you had Robert Kempner, who was on the American side, a man by the name of Monterey, the French prosecutor. I don't recall, let's see, who was it? The British was one of the Brit was one of the,
was it Griffith Jones?
Griffith Jones. Yeah. Yep.
How did the French prosecutor, if it was just in German and English,
yeah,
did the French prosecutor have a good command of either language? Or?
Yeah, well, actually, strangely enough, he and I were related distantly. And, but he was interesting. He was interrogating Helmut Knochen. Dr. Knochen was head of the SD in France, Klaus Barbie's boss, among other things, and probably among the most hated men in France. And Helmut Knochen came in, he was a little guy, came in like a sort of a rooster, very proud of himself. He had a PhD in philology, of all things. And he would, if you asked a question, I don't know anything about that, Monterey would get up, and this is where things became very informal. He would walk across the room, show Knochen a document, and Knochen would say, well, yeah, that looks like my signature. Mm-hmm. One of the nice things, of course, that helped interpreters or translators a great deal is that not only did the Germans all have initials, of course, and we had lists of initials, but even more interesting, they always stuck to the same color. Oh. So if you saw a green one, you had a very small group of people who would have a green initial on something. And so Monterey went back, asked another question. Knochen again denied it. Monterey got up, walked over, showed him a document. And Knochen had to admit that, yeah, he probably had seen this, judging from the signature. Well, this went on for, I'd say, about 45 minutes. And Knochen, who, I guess he was probably 5'5", 5'6", seemed to get smaller and smaller all the time, until you had a reaction almost like Pavlov's dogs. Because all after that, all that Monterey had to do was lift up a piece of paper and ask Knochen a question, and he would admit it.
No kidding.
And this one, and every now and then, he would walk over and show it to him. Mm-hmm. Well, after the meeting, after the whole thing was over, I went over to Monterey and said, now tell me honestly, the things that you questioned this afternoon, those pieces of paper you held up, how many of them actually had any bearing on the question? He said some.
Great, I love that.
He had this guy, I mean, it was fascinating to watch.
Did Telford Taylor ever come over and do?
Telford Taylor never came up, no. No, he was busy downstairs.
Yeah. And so you actually had the commission in the Palace of Justice.
Oh, yes.
And it was above the Palace.
The courtroom, yeah.
I'll be darned. What were some of the other witnesses that you recall that kind of come to mind?
Well, probably among the people who are interested in this area, Dieter Wissely-Cheney. Wissely-Cheney was the deputy to, what was the guy's name who was tried in Jerusalem? Eichmann. He was deputy to Eichmann. Mm-hmm. Wissely-Cheney eventually, he knew his days were numbered. He was also the guy who was in charge of the 1944 implementation of the anti-Semitic rules in Hungary. And he was eventually extradited to Poland, which executed him. Mm-hmm. As I say, the general staff, obviously the ones I knew best, name-wise, were the general staff members. Halder, for instance, Field Marshal, or General, I guess he was a Colonel General. Halder, who was still rather unhappy at that time because Hitler had made him go towards Dunkirk when he wanted to go to Paris. So he was still teed off at that particular point. And then you had, as I say, head of the SA, Schellenberg, head of the German Foreign Intelligence Organization, Walter Schellenberg, mm-hmm. a key individual. Schlegelberger was deputy to Tirak and later on became the main defendant in the justice trial. He was a typical German old-time bureaucrat. So you had...
Was Manstein? Von Manstein?
Von Manstein, yeah. Yeah.
Von Lieb?
Ritter von Leeb, yeah. Ritter von Leeb, he was, I think, either Ritter von Leeb, who, of course, considered himself as sort of a victim. Of course, it turned out later on, I think he did quite well. He was given a big estate in Eastern Germany, in the East, mm-hmm. at that point. They questioned, one of the questions they raised, either with him or with von Rundstedt. Of course, none of these people had close relations with Hitler. Supposedly. Mm-hmm. They asked him about his birthday presents from Hitler. And he had gotten money, award from Hitler on his birthday. And he had gotten a picture in a silver frame. And so what happened next year? Well, he got some money and another same picture, same frame.
What was your go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you saw a side of these individuals which you probably did not see as much in the more formal setting in the main court.
What was your sense of these individuals? They kind of come in one at a time. They had some name recognition to you, but now they're captured, they're witnesses. What was your sense of them as individuals?
It depended on the individual. They differed a great deal. I might mention that one time I was really startled. I don't know how familiar you are, but one of the main excuses that Hitler had for going to war against Poland was an attack on a radio station at Gleibitz, in which case a few days earlier a group of Polish soldiers had invaded Gleiwitz. Gleiwitz took over the Gleiwitz radio station and broadcast anti-German propaganda. And as they left, there was a firefight, and one of the Poles was killed. So here comes a witness from the SD, which is the Nazi intelligence organization. And they asked him all sorts of questions. And then they asked him, in fact, I think it was Monterey who asked, and are you familiar with the Gleiwitz incident? He said, yes. And what was your role? I was in charge. That's the only time I ever went over to one of the prosecutors afterwards and said, please warn me. I mean, my jaw must have dropped because I remember the Gleiwitz incident.
Sure.
And we suddenly faced, the Germans had, what they had done, they had captured some poor Pole, put him in uniforms, and shot him.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else was pure fakery.
Yeah. As you were looking at the commissioners themselves, and you started talking earlier about Ari Neve, quite a story.
Ari Neve, well, he was very highly regarded. I believe he was, if I remember correctly, he had escaped from 2 German prison camps. He was a well-known figure, was about 28, 29 at that point. Had a swagger stick, which, however, as he showed me, he could open up in front. There was a glass vial on the inside for liquor.
Oh, is that?
Yeah. I admired his swagger stick, and he showed me what. And he then, after the war, became, I think, quite well acquainted with Thatcher, Prime Minister Thatcher, and he became, and I don't know his exact title, but the top British official responsible for Northern Ireland. And one day when he was driving out from Westminster after a session, his car just blew up. The IRA had killed him. There was a man who would have had, well, he already had a pretty important position, but
Absolutely.
he was well on his way.
Outside of Kempner, did Whitney Harris, I saw you have a picture of Whitney Harris here. Do you recall him being at the...
Yes, if I remember correctly, and I think he did come up. They sort of went slumming every now and then and came up to us. It was one of these things. I had an interesting experience. I think it was, in fact, yes, I have a picture of Whitney Harris with Father, I'll think of it, it's probably on the picture, with a priest, and he wanted a picture taken with me out in the hallway after attending this session. And we talked. The priest wanted to know what I would hope to do. And I said, well, I hope after go to college, maybe get into the foreign affairs field. Well, where would you want to go? Well, I mentioned four or five schools. And about a week later, I think it was Harris that came up and gave me a print. And I said, tell me, who is this gentleman? He said, that explains everything. That's Father, what was his name?
There was a Father O'Connor.
No, this was Father, the Dean of Georgetown School of Foreign Service, the one school you didn't mention. Oh, yes.
Oh, that's neat. Obviously, in the Holocaust Museum, here are several of your photographs. How did you get permission to do that? And were you a photographer?
No, I had permission to carry a camera in the courthouse, except I was not permitted to photograph in the main building, in the main courtroom, obviously.
Sure.
But I had a camera with me many of the times and took snapshots and pictures. I remember I had a Contax.
Did you find as you're taking pictures of some of the defendants, did they do any of this, balk or anything?
I was quite, you might call it respectful. I felt that I would never take a picture of somebody if they didn't want to take a picture taken.
These are all still photos, not
That's
movies.
all still photos.
Then once you took them, were they for just your own sake, or were they given to the commission?
No, they were the own sake. I at times had hoped of someday becoming a news photographer. And well, after some experiences afterward, I decided I wasn't quite ready for that.
Yeah. And occasionally you would go to the main trial downstairs.
Oh, yeah.
What was your impression of that trial?
Well, you knew you were attending a historic event.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating. I mean, most of these people I had heard of quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple of them that you really didn't know, like Fritcher, who was the stand-in for the Ministry of Propaganda and who eventually was acquitted. But most of the others were names that you knew, and it was interesting to see them there.
Well, being German, being Jewish, being involved with what was going on upstairs, did you have a chemical reaction
No.
when you looked at these guys?
No, I don't think so.
Hmm.
I don't think so.
When you came in, did you sit in the civilian area, or were you a VIP section?
No. We sat in the visitor gallery. No VIP treatment there.
During the high command, these 7 defendants, there obviously, it did filter its way down to the IMT part of it. Did you sit on it during that part of the case?
No.
No.
No, they put me to work after this commission finished. They put me to work translating stuff.
So you didn't get a chance to see the end product.
No.
What was the impression, if any, that your colleagues had of how Jackson was doing and how the trial was proceeding downstairs?
Well, I would say there were a few gaps every now and then because our prosecution team obviously wasn't too familiar with German history and events. But most part, I think they did very well. I remember, for instance, I think it was Dodd who was questioning Baldur von Schirach, who was head of the Hitler Youth, and asked him about one of the songs of the Hitler Youth, whether this did not reflect their attitude, etc. And I think it was Baldur von Schirach who said that, well, this is a song that dates back to the 15th century.
Is that right?
Which is what it was. I mean, it was one of these things, one of these folk songs that came up.
back to the interpretation, as you were doing the translation, did you see the transcripts when it came up, and did you correct them?
No, we didn't.
Yeah.
In the main court, of course, they would make a transcript during the night, and the next morning it maybe sometimes was necessary for the court to announce that there had been some mistranslations.
Right.
That was a tough job.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, especially bad with German, where you either you had to use real lousy English, or you had to guess what the guy is going to say, where the verb was going to come in. And then, of course, every now and then, interpreters cracked.
Mm-hmm.
I remember once sitting in the courtroom listening to Russian German. In other words, the German translation, and suddenly all that came was gibberish.
Right.
And there was a female Russian interpreter who just cracked.
Right.
So they had to stop and get a replacement. There was usually a replacement, and if we're talking about a replacement, that's 12 people.
Right.
And they had basically three groups. One group that was working, one group that was sort of hanging around, and one that was off.
Right.
So they had to get a replacement. This was the first time that the system was really being used extensively. And certainly the first time it was used for so many different languages. And now, of course, they teach this.
Right. Yeah, think about it. You were just, as was most of the folks, just kind of taken off the line, if you will, and thrown into the fire. What's your takeaway from that? As you had an extraordinary experience in being up close and personal to some of the top Nazi leaders. Your age, 19, 20, and here you are a few years older and wiser. What's your reflection on that? How did that change you?
Well, I don't think it changed me terribly much. Must say I was aware that this was a historic occasion. I've watched the results of the organization's trial of the organization sort of collapsed fairly quickly because, I mean, for instance, in the SS, everybody basically decided that anybody who joined the SS before 1940 was guilty. Later on, they drafted people. But this was it was an unwieldy situation. A number of these organizations were acquitted. In fact, most of them were. The General Staff, they said there are not that many people involved and they can be tried on an individual basis. Same thing with the Reich's cabinet. Of course, the Reich's cabinet never met.
Right.
I think after 1935 or something like that. They said, if anybody's to be tried, they can be tried individually. The SA was pretty well, was found not guilty because they were really nothing after the Röhm Putsch in 1934. Although they called attention to the fact that obviously some of the units undertook actions which were highly despicable, but not the organization as a whole. let's see now, the SS, the SD was combined, if I remember correctly, with the SS.
And the general staff.
The general staff. So basically, most of the organizations really were found not guilty.
And those
Which didn't mean they put their seal, that the court put its seal of approval on these.
But I think, as I understand it, that if they were found criminal, in other words, if they're found guilty in that organization, then that was used as evidence during the subsequent trials.
Well, it was not only that, but these people didn't show up during the subsequent trial, but in the denazification trials, it was used.
Yep.
And so...
And then, were there any surprises, frankly, when you watched the verdicts come down in October of 1946?
Oh yeah, I remember sending a list to my parents and writing what I expected would happen. And I goofed on a number of ones. I mean, one of them was Yodel. And the admirals, which actually had American military defending them or arguing for them. So those death penalties came as a surprise. Otherwise, there were some individuals whom I misjudged, but if you're ever interested, they have my letters to my parents.
Right here? Oh, I'd love to see them sometime. As you, here you're working at the Holocaust Museum, you were part of that Nuremberg story, and clearly part of the Nuremberg story is the documenting of the Holocaust, really for the first time at the trial. Couple questions, I guess. One is, what's the legacy of the Nuremberg trial, and have we learned much since then? Maybe it's a combined question.
Well, I don't know. Then now, of course, you have the International Court in The Hague. You don't have the sort of keep in mind, in the case of Germany, you had a great deal of documentation. I think the court, it was, I know Churchill said take him out and shoot him. That was his recommendation. I'm glad they didn't, because they were able to confront the individuals with their documentation and with their speeches and so on, and their actions. So from that point of view, I think it was most helpful. Some of the things that are going on in the International Court now, you only have one or two, and first that, and of course, considering where some of this took place, there's not that much documentation available. So efforts you can't compare the two the trials at that point and the trial at this stage of the game. I'm glad it took place, let's put it this way, aside from the fact that it gave me some interesting times.
Well, that it did. Are there any of your colleagues that you keep in touch with?
The only one I kept in touch with was a fellow by the name of Peter Uberall, who my wife knew his wife, and we lived a couple of blocks from each other, but Peter died about I'd say about a year ago. He would have been a much better subject for questioning this man. But he did some of the work on Sprecher's 2 volumes, and regrettably ain't around anymore.
Well, the good news, you are, and this was a piece of the history that is not well known, except for real Nuremberg scholars, that it existed and that it had a function not only during the IMT, but the subsequent trials as well. And you were in that eye of the storm.
Well, the subsequent trials, of course, were limited to specific organizations, such as the medical doctors or the individual ministries. Some went well, some didn't go so well. And there were, how many, 10, 11? I left basically after the first trial, and then spent 6 months, as I say, in Berlin and documents.
And working on the subsequent trial dealing with the judiciary?
Only with the judiciary.
Which ultimately was the basis of the movie Judgment in Nuremberg.
Yeah, well, it was also the basis for a book I wrote.
No kidding. How do we access this book?
I hope there must be a library or an interlibrary loan that must be available. This has specifically to do with the young man who killed the German third secretary of the embassy in Paris that triggered or was used for the excuse for Crystal Night. A kid by the name of Herschel Greenspan, and it's basically the title of the book is, I may as well give him a plug. The book's no longer in print. The Day the Holocaust Began.
So the day the Holocaust
began. It basically argues, although not, that is when things became organized.
We will make sure we have it at the Jackson Center. This is great. So, if you don't have it, by all means, try Amazon or something like that for a used copy. That's where I get mine. Sure.
I couldn't afford the new copies anymore.
Well, it's a great resource that Amazon and those others do, where they recycle the books. What question haven't I asked you?
Gee, I don't know.
I'm sure you've been interviewed in the past, but there's probably I want to make sure.
It depends what your specific interests are, and I really, about this aspect of the trial, I haven't been asked that much because people don't know about it.
Right.
And it's, in a way, it's too bad it's forgotten. On the other hand, maybe it deserved it, I don't know. Maybe it was an attempt to do something that was impossible to do. I don't know.
It's certainly a lot of people have written about that.
Oh, about the main trial, of course.
Yeah, but also the fact whether this was just overreaching and just a little hard to go through the proof process. Oh, Mr. Schwab, this has been fabulous.
Well, I'm glad you think so.
I do indeed, and I appreciate you taking all the time. And if you don't mind, I would love to continue to stay in touch.
You certainly can. If I can be of any help, let me know.
Terrific. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.